Just imagine if someone came and took your kids away. Took them far away, where you can't see them. Kids that you love and care for and were connected to your community. And then imagine if they told these kids to not believe any of their traditional beliefs, their religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs, the way they look, any of that. They call it social assimilation. Let's make them like us because we know better. The effects of that were incredible, and it all boils down to not listening. These communities have so much traditional knowledge and have thrived and survived and been stewards of the land and just done so much for so long. And we steamrolled over all of that because we didn't listen. We just didn't listen. And it's almost unforgivable. I can't imagine the people that have been through this and still have forgiveness in their hearts. I don't think I could do it.
Learning about my culture will always be ongoing, because it's all new to me.
Going to school, I had never heard of residential school, ever. It wasn't until probably my teenage years. So about 16, 17 is when I kind of knew more about residential school, and then kind of left it at that. That I didn't really know, but it was something. It wasn't until I started here at the Woodland Cultural Center. I was 28 when I started, and I really actually understood what a residential school was. And then the questions kind of started coming and asking my dad, where did he go? You know, how far back did this extend? And then finding out my grandma and my grandpa, both his parents, went to residential school. And my great-grandfather, he attended the Mohawk Institute as well on my mother's side. So on both sides of my family, they all went. And then I saw, as I learned more about residential school, how its implications have entered into our family dynamic, and more importantly, as well, our community at large. And then everything just kind of started to fall into place. I started to understand why our communities were in such, you know, crisis kind of as they are. Understood kind of my own life, my own history.
It's hard to understand your culture when you're not raised with it, and when you come into it later in life, you know, it's like learning something altogether all new again.
I remember my grandparents on my ma's side speaking about residential school and referring to it as the mush hole. But I look at it like, you know, many war veterans, they'll talk about camaraderie, they'll talk about friends and experiences, but they won't talk about what they seen, saw, experienced.
You feel a huge loss, and I feel that every day. I think how much has been taken and how much we'll never hear. And I don't think people, the general public, understand how much has been lost.
The residential school took away my natural mother. My parents are gone, you know. I don't know who they are. I mean, I knew who they were, but I don't know who they are. You know, I don't know what they went through. I don't know their culture. So for me, I live on the reserve, well, just off the reserve now, but living on the reserve was hard to identify with that culture.
I didn't find out till I was an adult. Till I was like maybe 30 years, about 20-something years ago we found out. Nobody said anything to us, so. And we sort of looked at her surprised, huh? You never told us anything about this.
Yeah.
It was a big shock to us, so.
He wouldn't speak about, like, you know, like war stuff. He wouldn't, like, for example, I didn't know my father had a Purple Heart and took shrapnel as a military gunner. You know, I didn't find that out until he was in his 60s, late 60s. And so in the same manner, you know, I didn't find out about my father's residential schools trauma until I had the chance to bear witness at his alternative dispute resolution hearings. That's when I heard explicit truths about his experience there.
You know, you and I know it's not out there. It's not it's not discussed. It's not a subject to learn by yet. 150 years. It's not a subject to learn by yet.
Knowing that what happened in the residential schools and seeing the elders, the ones that had actually been through the residential school system, seeing how they raised their family, when you actually know what happened, you understand why they did what they did, you know, whether it was the drinking or the abuse, you know, you understand that after you know the facts.
To me, for one, to give up your child, forcibly to give up your child, and then two, not have the means or be able to see them for years. I couldn't imagine that. And then the abuse that took place at these schools and some of the stories that I heard, it's just, I couldn't believe it. It made me sad and it made me mad all at the same time.
It was really hard for me growing up. I was really ashamed of who I was because I didn't know who I was. I saw bits of racism and things here and there. And it was just really hard being an Indigenous kid in a predominantly white school. And there wasn't support. There wasn't support for any of the feelings that I was having, partially because they weren't educated. And so we still see those problems today when teachers are not educated, and you know, it's still happening.
These survivors weren't in households. They were in institutions. So then they become parents and they have no knowledge or no example to base anything on. And then they pass that on to their children, and they pass that on to their children. So with that comes multiple impacts. And we as a community, as families, we need to start looking at those impacts.
We have a youth epidemic of suicide. We have missing and murdered Indigenous women. You know, drugs and alcohol, you know, run pretty rampant on the reserves. All these factors contribute to a much larger issue. The issue of colonization, the issue of the most recent residential school system, and how it all affects us today. And yeah, I do feel that pain. I feel it every day. Because I see it with my son, that, you know, he doesn't have that language inherently. But thankfully, he's in daycare and they teach Kyuga every day. So, and he's taken to it like crazy, but I can't help but think how much he would have just had that had we just inherently given that to him.
It really didn't come to light in any expressed ways to us as children, except for hearing these surrounding conversations about the mush hole. That was back in the mush hole kind of thing. But they didn't talk about not eating, you know, working, getting beat, you know, the various forms of suffering that they were put through. That was never spoken to us.
So here I am, almost 50, trying to understand about residential schools. I would be reading well into the night, and what I was reading would bring me to tears. And I couldn't wait till the morning to go in and go up to Mom's house and ask her about, I had so many questions. So, you know, that's decades difference, and, you know, long time in wondering what what made up residential schools, how they came about, the history, everything.
My mother was unable to raise my brother and I, and Geraldine, my mom now, adopted us and took us in and treated us like her own. You know, we were raised no differently, but I know when I was growing up, I always thought I was different than everybody, you know, because skin color was one thing that really made a difference, and I thought I couldn't identify with anyone else who was Native. You know, I didn't know. I always considered I was part of this family, you know, and Native culture was not in our home. I mean, powwows we went to, but again, we couldn't identify with that. I couldn't personally identify with that culture, and I still have a hard time today identifying with it. You know, you could say, you're a status Indian. Well, who is a status Indian? You know, what does that exactly mean?
The fallout from residential schools just hasn't stopped. I mean, certainly the people that were taken away experienced horrific things, and I can't begin to understand it. You know, I have friends that have been through it, and I've talked with them, but it's not my experience. I can only witness it and be embarrassed by what we did. And certainly, you know, that kind of fallout affects every generation afterwards for years and years and years.
You feel like an outsider in your own land. It's a very crazy feeling to have. Kids didn't know what my identity was. I think that was really hard too. You know, being asked, are you Asian? Are you Spanish? Are you every other thing that I wasn't? But again, for that lack of education, knowing that Indigenous people are here, that we're still here.
Today, I mean, even my plate, you know, I have my heritage on my license plate on my car. I have stuff at my desk at work that shows my heritage. So it's something I'm very proud of, and I wouldn't want to be anything else.
But when you think back, you can't imagine what it's like to be a young child, you know, 4 or 5 years old, you know, getting a strap from someone you don't even know, you know. And so discipline, I always thought was really strict. You know, she was the disciplinarian, and I can see why, because that's the way she was raised. So Dad was the softie. If Mom said no, we went to Dad, and Dad would get us what we wanted, you know.
Or get us off the hook.
Yeah. But, you know, to see that, to know that that's what she went through gives us understanding as to why we were disciplined that way.
The discipline in our house when we were very young was very strict. When I gave my father's eulogy at the beginning of the month, I kind of touched base on that. I remember it always being strict. My father was very stern. When I was young, I remember my dad being the physical discipline we received. I received it. I witnessed it among our siblings. It was harsh. And I look back now during my eulogy, I said, was it residential school or was it from him being in the service? Was it a combination of both?
My dad was very much the disciplinarian, but I think some of that was residential schools and some of that was his military career. So we were all of us, when I say us, me and my siblings, we had strict rules to follow.
We were scared to death of the paddle. And back in those days, you were allowed to paddle a child on the butt, and Dad's beatings were different than my mom's paddles on the butt. I remember getting spanked when I did something wrong. I remember my brother, I think he was about 17 or 18, the last time he got paddled. And I forget what he'd done wrong, but I remember my mom saying, bend over. He bent over. She wailed 3 wallops on his butt, and he turned around and looked at her and said, you know, Ma, that didn't hurt. And she said, sure made me feel good.
They were strict. They were always strict, but they never, she never showed no signs of what she went through at the schools at home, because we always had the best of stuff, and we were treated well, and if we got in trouble and we deserved it, we deserved it. But other than that, they brought us up pretty good. Everybody got along, and we learned a lot of good values, and never had problems. Like, we've always fought. There's 6 kids. We always have fighting amongst ourselves, but a lot to deal with. But it was they had a lot to handle. But it was worth it, you know, for them to raise us all at once, and you know, and no signs of what she went through when she was young.
I always remember looking at old pictures and seeing all my sisters with the exact same haircut, and then seeing an Indian residential school picture. And this is in the 40s and 50s, and all these Indian children, the girls, had the exact same haircut as my sisters did in the 60s. So I see some of the physical carryover. I see some of the when you say lack of affection. My mom never hugged us, but my mom sacrificed so much in her life to make sure me and my brothers and sisters had a good life.
I mean, I know my father loved us all and loved us all very well, but, you know, he wouldn't express the term "I love you" openly or, you know, to any of us.
I think the most apparent effect of residential school for me was that my dad never really was completely open to hugs and that affection. Doesn't mean that he didn't love me. I know my dad loves me. He shows it in so many different ways. But just to hug or to actually say those words, "I love you," was always very difficult for him. And it was difficult for me to try to understand that growing up. So I think I looked for that in other ways, getting older, getting into other things. And but again, I didn't want to transfer that to my son. So the first, couple weeks that I was at the Woodland Cultural Center, doing tours, just kind of starting, I cried every single day. I would go home and just hug my son, and he would just be squirming, trying to get away from me. But I was like, no, I'm gonna hug you. You're gonna hear "I love you" a million times a day. And he is the sweetest boy and most lovable kid, and able to say, "I love you, Papa. I love you, Nana. I love you, Mom."
Love is displayed in different ways. My dad was a hugger and always told us that he loved us, and my mom wasn't.
My parents were total opposites. I think that harsh, hard discipline that my father taught helped my mother raise 6 kids on her own.
To hear my dad speak of being taken is really hard. Sorry. My dad talked about the story of how he was taken to residential school. I just think of my boy. I can't help but think of my boy when I think of my dad. He was taken to residential school when he was 7 years old. He was playing ice hockey with his friends, and a car pulled up and asked, "Where's Tom Rubin?" And of course all the boys didn't want to get taken, so they pointed to my dad and they picked him up and put him in the back seat with his brothers and sisters. And when they took him to the residential school, he went to Bishop's Horton Hall. And when they took him, he still had the skates on his feet. So they walked him in just like that. And that, that's the beginning of that separation of everything. So my dad was there for 5 years. And after 5 years, he didn't speak his language anymore. And it's hard because that's half of who I am, and I don't have that. I didn't have to go to a residential school to have the effects of it. I live with them every single day. I'm half Cree and I'm half Mohawk, and I only speak English. It's really hard. Because I think there's so much to be found in our languages, and so much of that is God.
Kids can't even talk to their grandparents. They speak different languages. You know, how do you learn your culture that way? There's systemic things that happen from people having to deal with being in those situations. I mean, you don't leave a residential school, and from what I've seen, and just instantly, oh, it's okay now, it's going to be better. You suffer extreme, oh man, stuff I can't even begin to understand. And dealing with that and processing that, it's going to affect families for generations and kids in many, many different ways. And I think it's really, really important that this story is told across the country. I mean, to me, it's an embarrassment that any of this happened, and it needs to be heard.
A good friend of mine started a project of heart, and it goes into schools throughout Canada. And it's been in so many schools, and what it is, it's an educational type tool to teach students of all ages about the Indian residential schools. I'm trying to carry on that legacy for my mom and for my dad and for all the other survivors, even my mom's brother who never made it back home. So there's things that we can do to carry that legacy on and to make sure it's not forgotten. Now, as far as the forgiveness, I think in order for everyone to heal, both the Aboriginal and the non-Aboriginal, I think we both have to forgive.
I've noticed with residential school survivors that if they haven't taken the moment to kind of pause and say, I don't want this for my kids, or I don't want this to continue, it can be in any shape or form of that, those things kind of tend to continue. And I think the breakdown between my dad and his dad, kind of transcended to my dad and my brother. So we see the breakdown of that family dynamic. But they're working on that, they're building that. I definitely have that with my mom. Just that breakdown again of family dynamic, because her grandpa had attended the Mohawk Institute. And yeah, I think I live with all of it. I carry all of that. And it's just discerning for myself, what do I want to give to my son? What do I want for those next generations to come? And I'm making progress myself, trying to just be the best mom that I can be. But it's hard. Every day is a struggle.
Everybody on both sides, they need to learn, be open to learning, become more knowledgeable. History matters. It matters on Native side and on non-Native side. We have to become more knowledgeable. We have to become more understanding of each other.
I can blame the colonists, but at the end of the day, it comes up down to me. Or us collectively, together.
It's a journey, it's not easy. I mean, even if you know the right things to do, it's not always just, okay, I can change everything I am today and do something better. It's hard, it's such a struggle.
People have to look at themselves. Their personal history racism, lack of knowledge, that begins at the kitchen table, at the dining room table. It begins when a child's not born with those understandings, those thoughts, those tendencies. It's a learned behavior. Well, if we learn that, then we can learn other things.
It's hard because I don't want him to be ashamed of who he is. I think that's the one thing I don't want him. Because it took me my whole life, almost my whole life as of now. It took me 28 years to get to the point where I could be proud of who I am. And I constantly think of all those First Nations kids who are 12 and 13 committing suicide. And I just think I don't want that for him. I don't want him to be ashamed or be lost. Because at one time, in the future, I have to sit down with my son and tell him what happened to his grandpa, what happened to his great-grandparents, you know, and he's gonna have to, you know, sift through all that information. But I don't want him to feel ashamed, and I don't want him to feel guilt. So really a lot of what I do is trying to better myself so that I can give him the best future.
So what should our next step be?
Well, I think I do know what the next step is. And the next step involves listening. And I mean, that's all people want. You want to be heard. You want what you have to say to be listened to. And that never happened, right from the very beginning, with social assimilation and all these things. It never happened. And it's simple. And just instead of throwing money at a problem or dreaming up some plan in a boardroom and then slapping a template on the community, and then as soon as the money runs out, you're gone, go spend time in the community, talk to the community, talk to leaders, talk to elders, figure out what they need, listen. Go have your next corporate board meeting in an Indigenous community. Go be awkward, go make mistakes, figure it out. Like, that's the only way you become friends with somebody. If it's a neighbor, you don't completely trust that person right away. And you have to have interaction, you have to hang out. Sometimes you have to have an argument, like a family. That stuff needs to happen. It doesn't take money, it takes time and understanding and deep listening. And we haven't done that. And there's so many powerful, important stories coming from these communities. Country needs to hear it.
The seventh fire prophecies of the Anishinaabeg, and it's critical to last to everything else was prophesied about the coming of the colonizers, the loss of culture and societal and our societal norms and our ways were lost. But the seventh fire speaks to the time that we live in now, and there's a resurgence of our culture, of our language, of our values. But what it speaks to is that the eighth fire is a time of choice. And the time of choice is that we will have our ways, and then we have an obligation to again try to reteach the newcomers to our lands across this planet, actually. What I find as the interesting paradox is while our culture is resurging, there's an unwillingness to share it. And it doesn't matter across colors or races of beings, these archetypes of behavior of love, hate, anger, they're ubiquitous across all humanity. And you can't change those things as we relate to each other as individuals or within our communities. We can change how we act collectively across all races in terms of this planet because the needs are the same. But right now, in terms of our prophecies, we're leading up to a point where we need to, as human beings, actually figure out how to live on this planet and actually continue to live on this planet.
We need to take control of our own people again. We need to have the government back off, allow us to be who we are. You know, Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee people, their governance system is the oldest living participatory democracy in the world. We've known how to govern our people. We were fine, you know? So I think a lot of it just needs to be, you gotta back off. You gotta allow us to do what we need to do.
You know, as my mother often cites, it was a process of racism, colonialism, and genocide. And it's a genocide that still continues today because of those disparities. This genocide is about land and resources, and we're in the way. We've always been in the way.
What is Canada founded on? We have to look at these big things, because what residential school is doing to Indigenous people and Canadians is it's shaking our very core of who we think we are as a people, as a community, as a nation. And we cannot continue to live on lies, because that is just going to continue the cycle of stereotypes and racism, and where we can find 7 kids found in the river in Thunder Bay and think it's not a hate crime. So I think we need to really look at these things in a much bigger scale, the bigger picture, because again, it's for the kids that are coming. What legacy are we leaving behind if we just sit back and continue to be complacent?
As our children age and become parents themselves, I know that we've done pretty good. And I know that we're going to take it another step further, and we'll do right by them. And they'll do right by us.
We can say so many apologies, and First Nations forgive. Like, we can forgive. It's not about, I think, forgiving so much. I think forgiving would hold more if they weren't doing it still. It's like, how can you forgive somebody who's still like standing on you? Or how can you forgive somebody whose ship is still on our canoe?
You know, I get angry. They don't listen. They don't take the time to be uncomfortable.
They being?
Government and regular people. Like, how many times, okay, it's as simple as you're in your own community, right? Let's say you're in downtown Sarnia and you're walking down the street and there's an Indigenous person there. Are you going to say hi? Are you going to go talk? Are you going to start a conversation? It's that simple. Get to know somebody. These are people. They're people like us. You know, it's that basic. It's human stuff. It's listening and understanding and having conversations, and like I said, being awkward, making mistakes. But you know, if these mistakes come from somebody who's well-intended and with a good heart, you'll figure it out and you'll become friends, you know, that trust thing. But that's what needs to happen. It's not money. It's not, it's listening. You know, people don't listen.
Such a big lack of knowledge of an incident, of history, of experience, of trauma that affected my family. And then came the shock that people didn't know about this part of Canadian history, that, you know, it's not out there. It's not in history books. People don't talk about it. I was shocked by that.
I see people every day at my job that this is still like completely new news to them. And then, you know, and then it's the part of the depth of it, how bad people actually know this to be. And where my grandpa went to residential school, they had a homemade electric chair that they used on children. And that truth still needs to be told. It's still, you know, they're still dealing with that in the courts right now. So I think the truth part still needs to kind of happen everywhere.
When we were growing up, we never knew the facts, so we never had to worry about that pain. Both mom and dad, you know, just pure love. And if dad knew that mom had suffered that, we never know that. Dad and mom kept it really out of our lives altogether. So you have to give her all the praise and glory, because It takes a lot to go through that and then be able to still smile and raise your children, you know.
You know, one of the things I'm always grateful for is my folks made sure that they knew I was Nishnabek, or Indian as it were, and so that was instilled in me. Like, you know, we'd cross the border and my father would always say, well, what's your citizenship was the question. My father would always say North American Indian.
My dad was a military man. He did a tour in Korea, 2 tours in Vietnam. He was in 2 plane crashes, 2 helicopter crashes in Vietnam. He was a prisoner of war. I don't remember much with my dad, doing things with my dad as a child, but I remember that he committed a crime. He was sent to prison, and I remember visiting him in prison. And even though he did something wrong, I still looked up to my dad as being my dad. I still loved him, I still respected him. And when he came back home, he moved here to Wappo Island. I remember spending my weekends coming over here and spending time just with my dad, just me and my dad.
She is a hero to a lot of people. I know a lot of people that she may not know that have come to me and said, you know, your mom is just doing tremendous work, speaking out about what she went through, you know, her sufferings, you know, and that's what's made me strong enough to know that no matter what, I can still go on, because that was what she instilled in us, was a strong value of raising our family, you know, and showing that love and how important it was.
I miss him. I walked in the house today and his chair's empty, but he's a good man, and all the stuff that he's been through, he still was a loving man. He didn't have hate in him. He was still a loving man.
I see my dad with my boy, and it's like he's learning how to play. Even though he's in his 60s, he's learning how to love again. And he sees the importance of those things.
My parents, having lived through the experience of residential school and however they internalized it, one of the things I think was important for them, whether it was spoken or unspoken, was they didn't want their children to be subjected to that.
I think I got a lot of my positivity and hope from my dad, because he said, don't live in the past. Like, don't live with what happened to me. Take that and make it better for Liam, my son. Make it better for, you know, future generations. And that's, I think, our focus. That's what I think our focus continues to be, is what do we want for our kids?
You're like a stranger. To your own family.